Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, verse 25, go check it out for yourself. He said that a house divided, a family divided, a city, a kingdom divided cannot stand. Again, he informed us, and he ought to know, he is the creator. He said a kingdom, a city, a family, a house, or any other group cannot stand if it's divided, if it's fighting against each other, if it's experiencing a civil war. That house can't stand. That house, that kingdom, whatever entity it is, it's going to fall. It can't stand, can't withstand either. If it can't stand, that means it can't withstand opposition. And that has been a key area where our opponents, white supremacists, where the racists, have been able to trip us up because they've always been able to penetrate, to find those folks who are willing to cooperate and to collaborate with them against our community, which brings about what? Disunity. All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about an institution in our community, the church, Black clergy. And I'm going to talk about one pastor in particular who said some things recently that I must respond to as a civil rights lawyer. He said some things about the Civil Rights Act that I have to respond to. And not only am I a civil rights attorney, but I'm also a preacher for over 40 years. Now, a few days ago, I was happy to bring you a really great story, a feel-good story. And that is where the civil rights community itself unified to fight against the anti-Black policies of the Trump administration. I love that story. I enjoyed bringing that story to you. And many of you also express just tremendous gratitude and how you enjoyed it as well. Well, we need to get this other institution unified as well. The church, Black clergy, because one is saying one thing about civil rights, another one is saying and doing a completely different thing about civil rights. And we don't need to be messing around where it comes to civil rights. All the benefits and all the good that you're experiencing today is the result of the civil rights movement. With the African American community, you just need to look at life after the civil rights movement and life before the civil rights movement, and you'll see how important the civil and voting and housing rights are to our community, because we live in an extremely racist country around people who wrote the book on racism. And without these protections, wow, we already know what we could experience. And yet you got Black clergy saying all sorts of untrue, I'm going to be nice here, untrue, inaccurate things about civil rights. All right, so I'm talking about, again, civil rights, and I'm talking about Black clergy. So where must I start? Absolutely. Several days ago, the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. passed away. I think he was 84 years old. And to sum up all that he did on behalf of the African American community, I would say that he was a civil rights icon, a legend. He was a juggernaut. A juggernaut, meaning he was an energy, a powerful presence when it came to civil rights. And he was also a protege of the incomparable Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And notice this. They led the civil rights movement through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They were preachers. They were Baptist preachers. They were Methodist preachers. There were some Pentecostal preachers who were also contributing to this movement. And the thing is, that organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was unified. It was unified. Now, was there complete uniformity? No, sir. There were some disagreements. But for the most part, they were unified. I salute my fellow Aggie, the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. Thank you, Reverend Jackson, and thank you to the Jackson family. I personally know two of Reverend Jackson's sons, Jonathan and Jesse. We went to college together. And they are fine people. Reverend Jackson, fine. He was a fine man. His daughters, his other son, his beautiful wife. I really honored this family, and I thank them for what they did. When he ran for the presidency in 1984, I remember him giving an electrifying speech that really impacted me. I also worked with our local NAACP to get people in my community registered to vote so that they could go vote for Reverend Jackson. And I also had the honor of marching with him and his sons, I think both of them, when we were trying to get corporations and companies, banks and so forth here in America to divest from South Africa from apartheid. We marched from our college campus, A&T in Greensboro, to downtown Greensboro, where the Bank of America headquarters was at that time. I'm so happy to look back and know I played a little small part in that. And it wasn't long after that apartheid came crumbling down. Nelson Mandela was released from prison and became the president of that country. That was accomplished because, again, of this icon, this juggernaut, this protege of Dr. King. So once again, we salute this family. Now, there is division amongst the preachers, and I want you to hear from them. All right? I want you to hear from them. So I'm going to play two clips. One is of Reverend Freddie Haynes. He's a pastor here in the Dallas area. And another one will be from Apostle Alton or Alton Williams. I believe his church is in Memphis, Tennessee. All right, and you're going to hear or see two different takes, two different sort of attitudes regarding civil rights. All right, and then I'm going to talk about who I believe is right and who I believe is wrong. All right, let's go. So this first video is Reverend Haynes. Reverend Haynes.
If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around in 1962, when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up, period. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent, period. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance in 1963 to try to tell Americans about a dream that I had had. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze.
The National Urban League has always had its roots within the church, bridging faith with activism. For generations, Friendship West Baptist Church has been a force for justice in Dallas, Texas, carrying the legacy of civil rights work birthed in the Black church beyond its doors.
Martin King had been stabbed at a book signing in Harlem. and now the tip of the blade was on the edge of his aorta. Dr. King said, if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around in 1962 when in Albany black folks straightened their backs up. And whenever you straighten your back up, you're going somewhere, because no one can ride your back unless you're bending over. He has surgery, and what hurt him initially now left a cross scar that covered him, and now he had a testimony of survival, of bouncing back from what could have taken him out. That's my word to all of us with scars, and that is, we serve a Savior who will cover you with his cross, and what should have taken you out, God will give you power to bounce back.
Reverend Dr. Frederick Haynes III is a social activist, educator, and minister who serves as the visionary leader of Friendship West Baptist Church. A third-generation pastor, his passion and power radiate from the pulpit through his words and spiritual leadership. I met with Reverend Haynes to learn more about the role of religious institutions and Black theology within our political movements. I'm Jerica Richardson with the National Urban League, and this is Justice Now.
One of the pieces that was lacking on our side of town was not just affordable housing, but quality housing. Mm-hmm. This was just an open field. Mm-hmm. So about 20 churches came together, and we built the first housing development on this side of town in decades. We called it Unity Estates. So again, that whole concept of doing more together than we can in our respective silos is so important.
If we can do this one thing together, imagine everything else that we can do.
Exactly.
Right.
So this is where our property line ends, basically at this hill. And the other company, they bought the 18 acres between our line and the county building right there. And when they first bought it, we didn't know that they were going to, do a truck yard. That's what I kept calling it, a truck yard, which I understand was offensive to them, but that's basically what it was.
That's the purpose it was going to
house 18-wheelers. And, first of all, when you look at this street, it's not big enough for 18-wheelers to go up and down this street. That just makes no sense. And so they asked us to cooperate with them when it came to an easement, and so we said, no, we don't want this kind of development.
So you cannot just think about what you're doing.
No.
You have to know and understand the impact of what's happening around you, but also be engaged before those things, before those plans are even made.
Right, so we sued the city of Dallas, we sued that company, we went to court, and we won. And now we are in conversation where with that same company, we're going to build much needed housing on this side of town. But the church had to step outside of what it normally does and say, we're going to sue the city. The Black church was born as a protest movement because the white church was providing the model for Jane and Jim Crow segregation. They established what apartheid looked like. The white church did that, and the Black church said, nah, that ain't the way this is supposed to be. Our Christ ain't like that. Jesus is always ministering to those on the margins. Jesus is always showing up, even born homeless. And we rescued him from a theology that basically divorced piety from justice in public policy.
Now that was powerful what he said. He said, the whole story is powerful, right? But when he said at the end that the Black church rescued Jesus from those who separated piety from justice, that's powerful, because that's exactly what the white church has done. You see, the kingdom of God is about righteousness, piety, and justice, both. But they hide the justice side because they have engaged in much injustice, and they tend to just stress the piety and the righteousness. And what they apparently don't realize is you can't be righteous and pious without being just at the same time. So I wanted you to see this from Reverend Haynes here, Dr. Haynes, Freddie Haynes, who is one of those preachers who focuses on both righteousness and justice, as the scripture says. So while he's preaching Jesus on Sundays, he's also preaching justice for Monday through Saturday. You get what I'm saying? All right, now let's contrast him with another preacher, Apostle Alton or Alton Williams. He has a completely different take on civil rights. All right, let's watch him, and then we're going to, I'm going to critique what he says. And I'm going to stop a couple of times in his sermon here because I want to highlight several things, make sure you understand them. All right, let's go.
Today I have given you the choice between life and death, blessing and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life, the things that would bring life. Watch, so that you and your descendants might live. The choices y'all are making today with your homes, with your families, are going to outlive you, whether good or bad. How you living in front of them, how you choose to live in front of them is going to outlive you. Listen to me. Your choices will determine whether they will have life or whether they will have blessing. You can get mad at me all you want to, I don't care. Here's the point that I'm coming to. I went back and asked the Lord, at what point did we quit passing it down? When did it happen? Because in the early 1900s, 90% of black folk was in church. Around the country. God, what happened? At some point, we quit passing it down.
Now, when he read Deuteronomy 30:19, that is a verse of scripture I am very, very familiar with. And it says exactly what he read. Where God told Israel, I've set life and death before you, blessing and cursing. Choose life. Don't choose death, choose life. In other words, choose to live in such a way that it will produce life. And then God attached a promise to that. He said, if you choose life, then you and your seed, your children, your descendants will live and be blessed. Just what he read. Now, what he goes on to say is the African-American community was once heavily involved in the church. He says 90%. I have not been able to confirm the 90% number, but I do agree that in the early 20th century, the 1900s, yes, more blacks were attending church than not. Now, whether it was as high as 90%, I don't know. But I do know this, that blacks were also attending church in very high numbers during the civil rights movement, because the church was not only meeting the spiritual needs of black people, but also fighting on behalf of them in terms of justice, fairness, equity. And maybe that is part of the reason why African-American people are not in church as they used to be, because many African-American churches have gone off the deep end. And I say that as a preacher. But keep following him here, because he's going to tell us where he thinks the break from the church occurred, where he thinks that black people stopped going to church, the cause for it. Let's go back.
And I can pinpoint the exact point when we quit. If you go back and look at some videos of black folk that lived in Tulsa, they were millionaires. They had their own Wall Street. They were doctors. They were businessmen. They were inventors. I found out one black guy had his own car manufacturing company. Madam C.J. Walker had her own hair care business. Them folk lived good. What happened?
Now, the implication here is that during Jim Crow, because he's talking about the Jim Crow era, right? It was in the 20s when we had Black Wall Street in Tulsa. That was in the middle of Jim Crow. And he is inferring here that black folks were doing very well during Jim Crow. He's inferring here that black people were wealthy during Jim Crow. And that is not true. Some black people were doing well, but most, the overwhelming majority, were not, because Jim Crow was a horrible time for African American people. And you notice here, Apostle Williams did not provide any data. I will give you data, because I don't want you thinking that life was good for black people during Jim Crow.
They had a business mindset, an entrepreneurial spirit. What happened to us? I can give you the pinpoint time. You can go back and trace the problems of when they started. It go back to 1964.
Okay, there he goes. 1964 was the year that the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. And he says that that is when black people started having problems. Now, all the problems that black folks had already had during 250 years of chattel slavery, he seemingly discounts that, or he dismisses that. And all the issues that black people had, even after slavery ended under Jim Crow. No, he says in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that was when black people started having trouble. Now, let me show you that's what he just said. That's literally what he just said. Let me see if I can just back it up here just a little bit. I want you to hear it. And I'm not trying to be mean to my brother here. I just think he's ill-informed. And I don't want him to ill-inform you. All right? Let me see if I backed it up further enough.
1964. And maybe a little bit before that. Want me to tell you what happened? The Civil Rights Movement.
The Civil Rights Movement, he says, is when black people started having problems. Not during slavery when they were chattel property. Not during Jim Crow. Now, I'm going to go through some of that. But it started, he says, when the Civil Rights Movement began.
I know y'all don't like to hear that. I know y'all don't hear that. I know it. What was intended to bless us ended up cursing us.
He doubles down. He calls the Civil Rights Movement a curse. He calls the Civil Rights Movement a curse. Intended to bless us, but it became a curse. That's what this man just said. The work that Reverend Jesse Jackson did, the work that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his life to, the work that Medgar Evers died for, the work that so many people, Christian people, a clergy-led movement, he says it cursed the black community. And when you hear why he says that, it's gonna amaze you. All right, let's keep working it.
Because the Civil Rights Act required that women will give you some money, but you can't have a husband in the house.
I'm trying to be nice here. I'm trying my best to be nice to Apostle Williams. So let me just say this. What he just said was utterly false. Utterly. Provably false. Demonstrably false. Just outright false. Wrong. It is not true that the Civil Rights Act required husbands to leave the house so that mothers, black people he's talking about, could get money. And just one thing, if you just think about one little thing, you could see, I'm going to show you in a moment that is absolutely false, but there's just one little thing you can think about. If the Civil Rights Act required for fathers to leave the house in order for mothers to get money, then why didn't white fathers leave the house? Because it would have applied to everybody. After all, there are more white women on welfare than black. So why does he presume that this affected only black families? He is completely in error on this point. Totally. The Civil Rights Act was not a curse. It did not require fathers to leave the house. He's talking about the man in the house rule that I'll talk about in just a moment. This was just completely, utterly false. And thousands of black Americans will hear this and cause them to just begin to hate the Civil Rights Act based on false information. You got these preachers, you got these other people who are all doing everything they can to attack Dr. King, the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, and we're talking about a movement and laws that changed our lives. I remember. I'm 63 years old. I remember the tail end of Jim Crow. I lived it. Let's hear some more.
I'm showing you the pinpoint more. They weren't needing it to be good, to be a blessing, but somebody at the top said, okay, we'll take the money from the government, give it to the women, and we won't allow the husband to be in the home. That was the beginning. We told mama or told the wife, we will give you government money to take care of you and your children, but you can't have a daddy in the house.
Folks, there is not one single provision in the Civil Rights Act. There are multiple chapters and not one single provision, not one word, not one jot, not one tittle says anything about black men, white men, or any other man having to leave the house before mothers could receive money. This is what's being preached in our pulpits. And you hear folks in the background just clapping, agreeing, when this is utterly false. Now, I'm not attacking this preacher's motives. I don't know his motives. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that he's just simply ill-informed. But this right here is grossly ill-informed. And before you say something like this, you should just do a little bit of research here, and you would easily find out. Or if you don't, and most people probably don't have the skill set to really dig this up, pick up the phone and call somebody. Call me. Call me, Apostle. Give me a call. Let's talk about this. I'll show you where you're wrong. Somebody send this video to him.
So then we went from depending on God to depending on government.
I will address that in just a moment.
Now Uncle Sam is many black women's daddy. Oh, help me somebody.
These are white conservative talking points. These are white conservative talking points. This is what Ronald Reagan said about black women back in the 80s, that black women are welfare queens and dependent on the government. Wow.
Look, she ain't got to depend on God when she know government gonna take care of her. She ain't gonna get on her knees when that check coming in every month. So now the women ain't dependent on God and the men ain't at home to raise the children.
Because of the Civil Rights Act. That's what he's saying. Totally, utterly false, folks. And I'm going to show you. All right. I think we've heard enough of that. All right. Let's move on so that I can start showing you how wrong this preacher was in what he just said. Apparently, Apostle Williams doesn't fully understand the horrors and impact of slavery and Jim Crow on Black America. That's one of the issues. Anytime you say Black people's problems started in 1964 with the advent of the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Act is what caused Black people to start having trouble and to be cursed, you apparently don't know how horrible and the impact of 250 years of chattel slavery on our community, as well as 100 years of Jim Crow. So let's turn to someone who lived during that period, who lived during slavery, Frederick Douglass. And we're going to read an excerpt from his excellent book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Here's what Frederick said. If at any one time of my life more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or never too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. This is Frederick Douglass's account. He was enslaved. This is not made up. This is not fiction. This is not what someone heard. This is a firsthand account from an enslaved African-American person, Frederick Douglass. Work was scarcely more than the order of the day, than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye dried. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute. That's just a small excerpt of this book that I'm trying to use to explain to you that Black people's problems started long before the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement relieved Black people of many of those problems. It is hard to even wrap your mind around such a statement. Now, as regarding Jim Crow, I like to look to another author who wrote the book Slavery by Another Name. Slavery by Another Name. I want you to see it full stop because it is a really, really great book. All right. So hopefully you got the name of the book. Go get your copy of not only this book, but also Frederick Douglass's book. Okay, now, here's what he wrote. He tells the story. Let's just read it. On March 30th, 1908, this is during, obviously, Jim Crow. This is about the same time that Apostle Williams said that 90% of black people were attending church. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. Cottonham had committed no true crime. Vagrancy, the offense of a person not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a new and flimsy concoction dredged up from legal obscurity at the end of the 19th century by state legislatures of Alabama and other southern states. So this is what Southern whites did to create Jim Crow. These are Jim Crow laws that they began to implement after Reconstruction. All right? It was capriciously enforced by local sheriffs and constables, adjudicated by mayors and notaries public, recorded haphazardly or not at all in court records, and most tellingly, in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for black men. Cottonham's offense was blackness, because vagrancy, being able to prove that you got a job, that should have never been criminalized, but it was used against black men to try to keep them enslaved. Yet, in Apostle Alton Williams' mind, it was the civil rights movement that began to cause black people problems, trouble, that cursed them. No, they were already troubled. They were already dealing with many issues. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottonham was found guilty in a swift appearance before the county judge and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor. I didn't read anything just then about having a criminal defense lawyer, so he probably didn't have one. Unable to pay the array of fees assessed on every prisoner, fees to the sheriff, the deputy, the court clerk, the witnesses, Cottonham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. A year of hard labor for not being able to show that he had a job. This is Jim Crow. The next day, Cottonham, the youngest of 9 children born to former slaves in an adjoining county, was sold. What do you mean sold? That sounds like slavery. It was, but by another name. This time it was called Jim Crow. So what the jail did was sold this young man to a company. Watch this. Under a standing arrangement between the county and a vast subsidiary of industrial titan of the North, U.S. Steel Corporation, the sheriff turned the young man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail Company, gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottonham's fine and fees. So the county sold this young man to this company, a subsidiary of U.S. Steel. And in return, this company, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottonham's fine and fees for committing a so-called crime of vagrancy. So even after slavery broke the body, the soul, and spirit of black men and people, then they still had to deal with another 100 years of this kind of slavery, but by a different name. And yet this preacher says that it was the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement that caused black people trouble. What the company's managers did with Cottenham and thousands of other black men they purchased from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them. They did whatever they wanted to do with those black men. A few hours later, the company plunged Cottenham into the darkness of a mine called Slope Number 12, and one shaft in a vast subterranean labyrinth on the edge of Birmingham known as the Pratt Mines. There he was chained in bondage inside a long wooden barrack at night and required to spend nearly every waking hour digging and loading coal. His required daily task was to remove 8 tons of coal from the mine. Why was he in this condition? He was a black man. What law did he break? Nothing. They created this crap to enslave black men. This continued until 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was enacted. But according to this preacher, that's when the trouble started for black men. And actually, some of this continued even past 1964. I'm going to share a personal story with you in just a moment. Cottenham was subject to the whip for failure to dig the requisite amount, at risk of physical torture for disobedience, and vulnerable to the sexual predations of other minors, many of whom already had passed years or decades in their own Thonian confinement, their miserable confinement. The lightless catacombs of Black Rock, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated in pulverized coal, must have exceeded any vision of hell a boy born in the countryside of Alabama, even a child of slaves, could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population in the month before Cottenham arrived at the prison mine. Pneumonia and tuberculosis sickened dozens. Within his first 4 weeks, 6 died. Before the year was over, almost 60 men forced into Slope 12 were dead of disease, accidents, or homicide. Most of the broken bodies, along with the hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves scattered among the refuse of the mine. Others were incinerated in nearby ovens used to blast millions of tons of coal brought to the surface into coke, the carbon-rich fuel essential to U.S. Steel's production of iron. 45 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Green Cottenham and more than 1,000 other black men toiled under the lash at Slope 12, in prison in what was then the most advanced city of the South, guarded by whipping bosses employed by the most iconic example of the modern corporation emerging in the gilded North. They were slaves in all but name. That's what happened to black men during Jim Crow. And for a preacher to say that black men's problems didn't start until the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964 is horrible. And again, I'm being nice, folks. They figured out a way to keep black people enslaved. And you could say that this was even worse than slavery in some ways, because the way these men were dying during slavery, they had more value because the enslaver had to purchase these men unless they were born on the plantation. So they needed to preserve them. Here, they were property of the state, which cared nothing about them. This is an evil country. We live amongst a very evil, evil, evil group of people. And unfortunately, there are many blacks who cooperate with them. And I'm not saying that's what Alton Williams is doing. I don't know his motive. So, Jim Crow, housing oppression. I'm making the point that a lot of blacks really don't understand what the civil rights movement rescued black people from. So I'm breaking it down so you'll understand it for once and for all. You will understand, hearing that story, hearing what I'm saying, that there was not anything good that happened to our people during Jim Crow. A few people prospered, but even those people, many of them murdered, and what they had acquired was taken from them. Millions of farmland, not just destroying these prosperous black communities, but millions of acres of farmland taken from black Americans who, through grit and determination, got that farmland. So there was housing oppression operated through redlining, restrictive covenants, racial zoning ordinances, mortgage discrimination, exclusion from federally backed suburban developments. Black families were confined to designated neighborhoods, denied access to appreciating property markets, and blocked from the primary engine of American wealth accumulation, home equity. That's what the Fair Housing Act got at. And they still try to do this stuff, and will do it even more if the Fair Housing Act is eliminated. What are these people thinking about? Allowing Trump, voting him in office, and allowing him to either gut these laws or to misuse them. Listening to these preachers. This is astounding. Education oppression consisted of legally mandated segregation, extreme funding disparities, inferior facilities, shortened school terms, discriminatory discipline, and restricted access to higher education. States created dual systems designed to underinvest in black children, limiting literacy, skill development, and long-term earning potential. I wrote a book on education oppression, education injustice. Economic oppression. All this occurred during Jim Crow. Economic oppression included sharecropping, debt peonage, convict leasing, exclusion from labor unions, occupational segregation, wage discrimination. These systems prevented asset formation, suppressed income growth, extracted black labor without allowing wealth to compound across generations. I told you I was going to tell you a personal story real quick. When I was 12 or 13 years old, I saw slavery for myself. I saw an old man that a white tobacco farmer went to a jail or prison. We didn't know which, but he went to one of those places. And just as we heard about Cottonham, this white man bought this black man, and the black man was forced to work on this man's tobacco farm. How do I know that? Because I worked on that white man's tobacco farm myself. And I seen this older man, this older black man. His name was John. We called him Mr. John. He was about 80 years old at that time. Had been in North Carolina, the penal system there in North Carolina for many years. This white man bought him for, I'm sure, a little bit of nothing, and then forced him to work on that tobacco farm until he died. And he treated him like a slave. Mr. John was a slave. I saw that in my lifetime. I was 12 or 13 years old. That means I saw that 50 years ago, just 50 years ago. And I checked on North Carolina books. And that law is still in place today. Now, for all practical purposes, such laws should be unenforceable because of the 13th Amendment. But remember the exception to the 13th Amendment? Slavery is abolished except for punishment for crime. That's how they get around it. So, criminal justice oppression functioned through vagrancy laws, peonage enforcement, arbitrary arrests, all-white juries, discriminatory sentencing, racially biased policing. The legal system operated as a mechanism of labor control, social discipline, and racial containment. I'm trying to educate you folks so that you don't make the mistake of trusting these white supremacists, voting for them, supporting them, preaching their theology. Healthcare oppression included segregated hospitals and wards, inferior medical facilities, exclusion from insurance systems, unequal access to public health resources. These disparities contributed to higher mortality rates and long-term health instability within Black communities. Thank God for President Barack Obama getting through the Affordable Care Act, which got to the bottom of some of this, which prevents some of this for about 4 million African Americans. Yet some of you say he's done nothing for the Black community. The criminal justice system, the Civil Rights Act got at that. Economic oppression, the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act got at that as well. Yet this man calls this law a curse. And then there was racial terror. The KKK enforced the entire Jim Crow order. Lynching, mob violence, property destruction, and economic retaliation punished Black advancement and deterred resistance. Violence functioned as an unofficial but decisive arm of the legal system. What stopped this? The Civil Rights Movement. What stopped all that I just read? The Civil Rights Movement. What this preacher called the decline, the moment the Black community began to decline. What? How? We were already enslaved for 350 years. And the thing that God sent to free us and to lift us, the Civil Rights Movement following slavery, he says was a curse. And he based that on the erroneous ideal that the Civil Rights Act required, he used the word required, for men to leave the house. Wow. I'll address that in just a moment. Give me a second, because I want to make sure that we understand this. Apostle Williams' civil rights comments were legally wrong. His righteousness, morality, and marriage comments were biblically accurate. As I said, Deuteronomy 30, yes, I'm very familiar with that scripture. And yes, we need to pass down to our children, our grandchildren, what the Bible says about how we are supposed to live, the morality, marriage, the righteousness. But what we don't understand quite often is that's one half of God's message. The other half is justice, equity, fairness. That's the other half. This preacher got half of God's message and he omits the other half. He preaches the righteousness, the morality, and marriage and so on. But then he condemns the justice part of it. So let me now just go through his arguments and just refute them. So he said Black America was basically economically stronger. He inferred it. He didn't say it. He inferred it when he talked about Tulsa and all the business and so forth. That basically means blacks did better under Jim Crow. Black church participation declined as a result of the Civil Rights era. He said that. The Civil Rights Act required black fathers to abandon their families in order for black mothers to receive benefit. That's crazy. Government dependency replaced dependence on God. It's not factually correct. The Civil Rights Act is anti-biblical. That's the inference, right? If it was a curse, then it didn't come from God. So it must be anti-biblical. That's the logical extrapolation of what he said, that the Civil Rights Act is anti-biblical, that it's devilment, that it came from the devil. Because only the devil sends curses, right? When the truth of the matter is, civil rights laws made a huge difference. Constitutional amendments, Section 1983, Section 1981, which is the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 68, Higher Education Act, anti-hate crime laws, anti-lynching law. All those laws made a huge difference and ended, or at least punishes, when those kinds of things happen now, those racist things. We're still fighting. Much more needs to be done. Don't misunderstand me. But the way we live today versus the way our ancestors lived 3-4 generations ago, I tell you what, boy, if they could speak. So his first claim, that Black America did economically better under Jim Crow. All right, so here's my response. Separate but equal was the legal fiction of Jim Crow. Because in practice, we were separate but unequal. Black Americans were forced into segregated schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, and job markets that received fewer resources and fewer opportunities. Segregation pushed Black communities to build their own businesses and institutions out of necessity. Yet poverty remained widespread. In 1959, the Black poverty rate stood at 55% compared to 18% for whites, according to U.S. Census data. So where are all these rich people? When 55% of Black people in 1959, can you imagine in 1908? After civil rights laws dismantled legal segregation and open access to jobs, public places, and federal programs, the Black poverty rate fell sharply. By 1970, it had dropped to about 32%. Today, it hovers near 19 to 21%. Still too high, but far below Jim Crow levels. Legal equality did not solve everything. Structural and systemic barriers remain. But the data show this clearly. Civil rights legislation reduced Black poverty while Jim Crow entrenched it. Hence, attacks on civil rights by Black conservatives are weird when they themselves benefit too. All the benefit that Apostle Williams enjoys today, he should be giving credit to the civil rights movement. Instead, he's condemning it. These graphs show you that from 1965, 1959, 65, during Jim Crow, after the civil rights movement in 1964, look at the poverty rate. Look at how it is greatly reduced, down now to about 17%. Still work to be done. Still work to be done. But look at the positive impact of the civil rights movement, which he says started the decline of Black people. This proves him absolutely wrong. Second claim, Black church participation declined as a result of the civil rights era. Wow. The opposite is true. Church attendance has declined across all races. He offers no evidence that the Civil Rights Act caused a specific drop among Black Americans. Pew data shows Black Americans still attend church at higher rates than other groups, and the Civil Rights Movement itself was church-led and likely strengthened, not weakened, Black church participation, and it absolutely did. The third claim in inference, the Civil Rights Act required Black fathers to leave their homes in order for Black women to receive benefits. Here's the truth. The Social Security Act of 1935 created aid to dependent family, to the dependent children, which means what we call welfare, ADC, AFDC, TANF. That program started in 1935 and it was created for white women, white people. It was created 30 years, 29 to 30 years before the Civil Rights Act. And Congress didn't enact the Civil Rights Act until 1964. The man in the house rule was a state policy that Dixiecrats used to target Blacks. The man in the house rule was created in the 40s, 50s on the state level, long before, about 25 years before the Civil Rights Act was ever enacted. And it was used by Dixiecrats. They were in the Democratic Party, but it was the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party that targeted Black families with that rule. And those Dixiecrats then bolted the Democratic Party, left the Democratic Party, starting about 1948, when Harry Truman started showing some sympathy, some compassion for Black people. Those Dixiecrats started leaving the Democratic Party, going to the Republican Party, and they really did so in the 60s when Barry Goldwater ran for the president from the GOP. And by the time the 80s got around, Senator Trent Lott said that the party of Lincoln, talking about the GOP, had become the party of Jefferson Davis. So when these people say to you, well, it was the Democrats who made Black men leave the home, what they're not telling you and what I'm trying to inform you of is, yes, it was Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party. The progressives in the Democratic Party were not responsible for that. It was the progressives in the Democratic Party that helped pass the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and Fair Housing Act. So in other words, those people who say the Democrats used this man in the house rule, enforced that, what they don't say is it was the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party who eventually left and became the GOP. And that's why the GOP today is the party of white men, basically. That's why. That's the reason why they oppose everything. The GOP oppose anything having to do with Black people. Wow. And the Civil Rights Act, I must make this very, very clear. Very clear. Very, very clear. The Civil Rights Act is divided into titles. Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, Title V, Title VI, and on. Not one of those titles doesn't come close to saying men had to leave home before the mothers of children could start getting money. Not one has nothing to do with that. The Civil Rights Act is about racial discrimination. In fact, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act Title VI, it prohibits racial discrimination with any program, any entity that receives federal funding, including welfare. So Title VI opened the door for blacks to receive welfare, because before then, black people couldn't get welfare so much. And there's not one provision in that title that says black men had to leave the house. As a matter of fact, it was a U.S. Supreme Court case, King v. Smith, that stopped that practice. And that happened, I believe, in 1965 as a result of the Civil Rights Movement that stopped Dixiecrats, white conservatives, from using that rule against black people. That's wildly, grossly irresponsible to say something like that. The fourth claim in inference is that government dependency replaced dependence on God. All right, watch this. About 150,000 black adults and about 450,000 black children receive TANF. That's today what is commonly known as welfare. That's roughly 600,000 out of 47 million black Americans. Hence, about 98% of black Americans are working or seeking work. In other words, most black Americans, most black women are not on welfare. And those who get government assistance, most of them work. They are the working poor. Most of the ones who get Medicaid, they are the working poor. It is required of them to work or seek work. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed into law requirements that essentially got a lot of people off welfare, including mostly white women. The fifth and final claim in inference is, again, the Civil Rights Act is anti-biblical. Not when you have scriptures in the Bible that require Christians to be compassionate to the poor, to be just, to be fair. So correcting all the evil that black people were facing during slavery and then Jim Crow, changing laws to fix that, enacting laws to fix that, specifically the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and others, those are not anti-biblical laws or measures. The Civil Rights Movement was directly consistent with the Bible. Remember this verse. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of thy throne. Talking about God. God is a God of righteousness, and God is a God of justice, which means fairness. Apostle Williams focuses on just the righteousness part. He completely overlooks, dismisses the justice side when he calls the Civil Rights Act a curse. And completely misrepresented the law when he says it requires the Civil Rights Act required men to leave the house. Not one word of the Civil Rights Act supports that. All right, I'm Reverend and Civil Rights Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you watched it all the way to the end and share it. It's long, but look, some things you got to take your time with. This is very, very, very valuable information. And besides, I see people listening to foolishness for 2 and 3 hours. You can't listen to something that lifts our community, that educates and informs, protects our community for for half the amount of time some folks be spending online involved in dumb stuff? Come on, you all. Thank you for watching the video. And as always, stay woke, folks. Stay woke.